people say, oh, carbon's the basis of life. Okay. But what I'm saying, the flow of carbon is the flow of life. Flow is different than basis, because you think of basis as like, it's in a bowl. I got the recipe for cupcakes, whatever. No, it's the flow, and it's so endless and huge, and like 1.2 trillion carbon molecules in one cell in your body. For me, carbon was not about saying, look, I know a way, there's a path forward, I have a solution. We need to change, no question about it. But what I'm saying is that it starts with a state of being, a state of mind. It starts with seeing the world in a profoundly different way. It doesn't mean that in so doing, you don't do anything, but it's from a different vantage point.
Hello and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lynda Ulrich, and I'm also the founder of the mothership website of this podcast called The Goodness Exchange. There and here, you're going to learn about what's right with the world. There is an enormous wave of goodness and progress happening right now that almost none of us know about, or surely we don't know enough about it, because of course the negative noise in the news can't help but just stir up our fear and confusion. We've written thousands of articles about what's right with the world. And here on this podcast, we've interviewed now well over 200 innovators who are changing our shared future in ways that we should all be hearing about. Today, we're going to start with one of those innovators who, if you've ever felt like hopeless or overwhelmed about climate change, Paul Hawken is someone you need to know and you need to know more about. Paul is an amazing man. He's one of these folks who has the gift of taking a topic that's very complex and putting it in such a way that you just go, why didn't anyone say it like that? And what I'm referring to here is his latest book called simply Carbon. Spoiler alert, carbon is not the villain. It's not a pollutant. Paul writes in his book, it is the courier coursing through every particle of our existence. And when we start with that as a baseline of thought about carbon, we can change the future. In fact, one of the most important things about Paul's life and life's work is that he is recognized by most authorities in the world as having created the most comprehensive climate change project called Project Drawdown that has ever been created in history. So Paul has continued since creating Project Drawdown to be the featured speaker at climate change events all over the world. And he's written another book that I interviewed him about recently. So we'll link you to that. But, he just keeps on giving. And he is truly one of those people that says things in a way that you just feel good about what's possible when you listen. Welcome. And let's talk about this book, how much good is happening in the world, and what's possible now that we can all get serious about living more sustainable lives and how we can enjoy that future.
What goes into a book is I think for every writer, and depending on fiction, nonfiction, and all that sort of stuff, but it's observation of the world and curiosity, and then what happens, that alchemy, of the world interacting with your senses and beliefs, of course, and then this thing, where do the words come from? How do they emerge?
I said that to myself so many times in your book. Where do the words come from? Yes.
Yeah. Lynda, I have an experience. Where I write, where I'll do a couple paragraphs and then I'll edit.
Yeah.
Now, some people write 500 words or whatever, wake up the next morning and edit. That makes probably more sense for fiction. But whoever does it, they do it that way. I don't. And I've written 2 paragraphs, and I don't know how long it took to write it. You're at a kind of timeless zone. And then I've looked at it, and I've worked. I didn't know. I never knew this stuff. It's like I don't have the memory or the recall of actually writing those paragraphs. I can't explain that. I'm not saying some magic fairy is in the room. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying is that the way the mind works is really complex and stunning and amazing. And writing can bring that out of you but it's difficult. But if you're patient, or if it happens, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But I feel like and you going there, that immersion into that is sort of like, it's ecstatic and wonderful. It doesn't happen very often, so it's really hard to write a book. I don't
Well,
want to.
I wonder how given your long life and all the things, your circuitous path, it's all there. And the amazing thing is that when you sit down to write, it's like some computer, some machine that has learned from all that life and wants to create something on the page that others can learn from. It just happens. It's almost like you give your brain a marching order, and
Right.
it's doing it in the background.
It's interesting because we go to these analogies that are technological, like a computer, like, right away. And I would suggest that Carbon, the book, is about flipping that narrative, that the living world in all its intricacy, complexity, astounding mystery is actually running the place in our brains, in our hearts, and that we are definitely enmeshed in a very technological era, getting more so, and but it limits us and prescribes, and who we are. And I'm not gainsaying technology. I'm just simply saying that the human being, human mind, and not even going to call it the brain, because somehow the brain is where things happen. No, it's the mind. And what we know is that both our physical, biological body and our, mind go way past what we think is our container, and there's no such thing as an individual, not biologically. You can say, well, this is where my finger stops. Okay, that's fine for you. But the 40 trillion microbes, they're dancing around and going on, connecting and all that sort of stuff, don't have that definition of you.
We're just going to start this podcast right here. I press the record button, and I know that these seemed like kind of off the cuff comments between us, Paul, but what you've just said in the first 5 minutes here is, fundamental to the way we all can appreciate our role going forward.
Right.
And after reading your book, that's the whole point of your book. It doesn't need a long title. It's Carbon. Carbon, it isn't the villain. It isn't the pollutant. It's us. It's everything about us and everything that happens and everything about this planet. I mean, that is what you're doing. You're giving us the kind of information that we need, some of it probably learned in 6th grade that we've forgotten.
People say, oh, carbon's the basis of life. Okay. But what I'm saying, the flow of carbon is the flow of life. Flow is different than basis. Because you think of basis as like, it's in a bowl. I got the basis of, I got the recipe for cupcakes, whatever. No, it's the flow. And it's so, endless and huge, and like 1.2 trillion carbon molecules, in your cell, one cell. For starters, there's the first beginning of flow in your body and outwards. And I think that, for me, Carbon was not about saying, look at, I know a way, there's a path forward, I have a solution, or somebody else does, or here are the solutions, and we need to work harder and fight and, make these things happen. We need to change. No question about that. I'm not questioning, but what I'm saying is that it starts with a state of being, a state of mind. It starts with seeing the world in a profoundly different way. It doesn't mean that in so doing you don't do anything, but it's from a different vantage point than the one that, and I'm a perpetrator of this as much as others, but the whole climate movement, of really focusing on carbon as an element, as a thing, as, it's up there, there's too much of it up there, we've got to bring it back home and stop emitting it and sequestering it and, all those kind of things, it makes our mind really small. and objectifies this mystery that we're talking about.
That's beautiful. And I think the way you wrote that very first paragraph, can you read from the book? Do you mind reading from the book, Paul?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure.
So in the very opening of the book, you say all that in the most beautiful way. Starts with carbon moves ceaselessly.
Carbon moves ceaselessly through the four realms: the biosphere, oceans, lands, and atmosphere. It flows in rivers and veins, soil and skin, breath and wind. It is the narrator of lives born and lost, futures feared and imagined. It is the courier coursing through every particle of our existence, the interwoven lattice that permeates cultures, lagoons, minds, grasslands, organisms in our temporal life. Carbon's dance of life does not take sides. It is never right or wrong. It is a timeless path that endlessly unwinds before us. Like Ariadne's thread, the flow of carbon is a story that may allow us to escape the labyrinth of anxiety, ignorance, and fear the world bequeaths. Carbon's increase in the atmosphere moves in tandem with the loss of the living world. The book of life encircles what has always regulated climate, the pulsing, living mantle we call Earth.
Where did that come from? Was that just your initial thought? Do you remember the day when you sat there and all that spilled out?
Yeah, I do. I remember reading something that Bioalchemologist said, and that had nothing to do with that. But the freedom with which he used the English language and connected things was so exquisite. And then I sat down, and that actually was the second paragraph. And I realized, oh no, that's the first paragraph. And it was so interesting because, when you start a book, you want to, grab people by, say, come on in, turn the page. And I had really had them upside down and backwards, And so I was reading by Alchemology that helped me see that. Yeah.
Well, and I love one of the very first things you say somewhere is that from a planetary view, the warming atmosphere is a response. It's an adjustment. It's a teaching.
Yeah.
And you do say that in what you just read that the carbon is just it's the same amount of carbon. It's just either up there or down here in life, and
Right.
remind us of that whole complexity because that's me referring to our sixth grade science. I think we all sort of knew this balance was there, but we've forgotten it.
Well, I mean, we're all educated in science one way or another, by default or by choice, but we have to remember that the scientific revolution, that it was European and Western, was a revolution of naming and separation, identification. So you can't identify something unless you separate it. But that process then sort of inured us to thinking that everything was separate. In other words, it didn't reflect relationships at all or connection, or I would say the vast interconnection between the living world and what we call the non-living world, but where there really isn't a clear line, by the way. But we make that distinction. And so then when we started to become aware of global warming, 50, we were aware of it in the 19th century. So but I mean, in terms of the larger polity, becoming aware of governments and scientists and being broadcast in the news, this 50, 55 years ago, whatever. And then what we did is we objectified it. It's like, okay, we have global warming. Okay. What globe? What's that global warming? Actually, it's the atmosphere that's warming. And it warms the earth. Okay. And so there you go. So, right away, we're getting into language of climate change, which is, and then you get the adjectives, we've talked about this before. I mean, the adjectives that defy, combat, and tackle climate change, and these are very male words, using word sports, and that basically see carbon as the enemy, or change as the enemy. Because why would you fight or combat change if you didn't think it was the enemy? When in fact climate is supposed to change every millisecond. That's, thank God it does. We have spring, summer, winter, fall. We have crops, food, fish, and so change is not the problem. At least in that sense, because climate doesn't listen to us. And doesn't know what we think. So it's this kind of upside down relationship to Mother Earth. What an atmosphere and the biosphere are the same thing, that just one's gaseous, one's more solid. But I mean, we sort of flip that narrative somehow. It's supposed to do it for us. It's not good for us. That's wrong. So the warming of the climate is basically an adjustment. The atmosphere is adjusting to our activity on here on Earth, but it is not wrong. It's not bad. That's our belief. And that's based on what we do, what we've done, and what we want to do. And they're not working. They're dissonant, because we're getting the predictable outcomes of warming, which is drought and floods and heat and, just, a disruption of all the rhythms and patterns that we have grown up with during the Anthropocene. And so that's again about seeing, Lynda, about looking back and saying, wait a minute, the climate is not the bad boy. like somehow, and we're the heroes, we're going to go and, fight it and build machinery and this and that and all that sort of stuff. Again, I'm not gainsaying what people are doing individually, collectively, or corporately, or that really are trying to address, the situation. I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about the mind and the rhetoric and the way of seeing it that way, I think limits what we can do, what is possible, as opposed to expansive.
Well, and I think the way you were saying we objectify carbon, or we objectify the parts of the planet ties into our first initial reactions to it. Like, I'm not sure if it's such a big thing anymore, or maybe I'm not paying attention to the news. But when we did the biodiversity credits and the carbon credits chapter of trying to fix this, isn't that like the ultimate expression of objectifying what we do next?
Yeah. Ralph Chami at the IMF, who gave a TED talk about the value of a blue whale is $2 million. And and the implication, and he intended it, he had good intentions, which is that we should save the blue whale and somebody should put, $2 million into something, I don't know, biodiversity credit, that would go to expand or preserve habitat and, the ships that were hitting the whales, but all kind of things that we can do to, but the thing is that biodiversity credits or carbon credits are the capitalist mindset, which is you put a price on things and then you sell it to the highest bidder. And and I say we in this case, that is to say the Western colonists, self, that came out of Europe, have been basically selling the earth off to the highest bidder for 500 plus years. And that's why things are so screwed up. So the idea that somehow, that taking nature, in its more pristine state and say, well, okay, let's pay for that, us an offset, it's just off. Which not an offset. I'll put carbon over here. Oh, it's it's in the air, but I'm going to pay you over there to sequester it, or I'm going to, and so again, I'm going to mind, not the intention. I can't question other people's intention and well-meaning. So the mind is seeing it as a parlay, as a transaction, and that means separation.
And I think there's no grace in it. Like your previous book that we talked about on the podcast, I'll give people a link to that. And the way you address almost any topic I've ever heard you speak about, Paul, is there's a level of grace that you're looking for in our reactions in our innovation, like we don't seem to have a practice of really looking or seeing ourselves as having to find a sustainable, graceful way in the world.
Well, we weren't taught it.
Yeah.
I mean, we were children and we grew up in a world that is the one we live in today. And whether old or younger today, the fact is that everything we're talking about that in a sense is shooting ourselves in the foot with respect to creating a livable world is what we were taught. And it's reinforced by advertisements, by our healthcare system, by our so-called agricultural system. I mean, and of course now our political system, but I mean, so this thinking, this way of understanding the world has been demolished in terms of any semblance of grace and compassion and connection and kindness, And I mean, people are very drawn to Indigenous people and their thinking, the language, the practices, and why? Well, because I'll speak for myself. Everybody has to speak for themselves. But I mean, I emerge into a mindset, a way of seeing the world that doesn't separate. That's all. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's what Indigenous people, again, I don't want to like the people, and we're not. We were Indigenous once too, all of us. But I'm just saying in those cultures, there's a way of understanding that's so gracious and kind and non-adversarial. And sure, they can kill an animal and God didn't eat it, but how do they do that? They do it so differently with so much respect, so much honor to the buffalo or whatever it may be, as opposed to, farming it and then growing it, in fenced places and then butchering it in big factories, with migrant workers that are come up from the South, are paid lousy wages in freezing warehouses, and get harmed and injured all the time. Ooh, they're both eating meat. and one is doing it with so much respect, and the other is doing it with just complete lack of sensibility. I mean, I don't have to, your listeners know this.
Do you think it has anything to do with where we start? Like, I grew up on a farm in Illinois. We slaughtered 5-7 hogs every fall. You ate every part of the pig. There was a kind of respect just in the process,
right,
and the processing of this. And, it was a farm that was not good farmland for Illinois standards, and we had to make it work anyway and all that. Like, because of that, is it fair to assume that you and I have assumptions, and this grace, that this giving of the earth its due comes from the way we were upbrought, or do you think everybody's capable of it? Like, you have a wonderful part in the book where you say, when I was 4, vernal pools of salamanders, shuffling frogs, and scuttering tadpoles were practically family. That's a lovely part of the book. Do you think we have to start there, or else we don't take all this to heart? Or do you think it's something innate in all of us to appreciate the earth?
Well, I do think taking children from highly urbanized environments and immersing them into the living world is really, really, really important, because you can't understand where you live if you've been brought up in a city around concrete and noise and pollution. You just can't understand where you live. Now, I would go further to say most people, no matter where they live, don't understand where they live. They don't understand this planet we live on, but put that aside for a minute. So those experiences do change you. They change everybody, but they can't be had in a tenement. They can't be had in, low-cost housing that's, built like with brutalist architecture, I mean, yeah, they're no different.
So let's do this. You have this book is organized, I have to tell people, in these wonderful chapters that they're ideal for like listening in the car for 10, 15 minutes, or just breaking the process down is lovely. This book is just magical that way. And I think we're going to take a break, and we come back. I'll let you comment on some of these beautiful chapters. You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time or maybe even the emotional stamina to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So, if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the Goodness Exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness. Okay, we're back with Paul Hawken, author of the book Carbon, and so many other amazing insights in this world of ours. Paul, in this book, you kind of take topic by topic and weave the story of carbon in our lives in these. Let's start with a chapter called Dark Earth. This chapter about Dark Earth, it's foundational. I think the dirt, the soil, the earth in our lives, we don't pay it any mind. And it's where sort of everything starts. Start us there.
Yeah, I would say that the very fact that we think the words dirt and soil are interchangeable says a lot. Soil is an organism. And what most scientists will say, and I would disagree with them in this sense, is that, yeah, it has organisms in it. And, well, so do we, you know. And we call ourselves a human. Soil does have trillions and trillions of organisms inside it. That is to say, living soil that hasn't been polluted and chemicalized and plowed and so forth. But anyway, that organism is the basis of life in terms of what we eat, and many things that we make as well in terms of our clothing and other stuff. You know, leather from animals that eat plants that come from the soil. And so we if you step back and you say, well, look at all the cultures that have lived here that we know of and that are extant today, not one of them ever called the earth Father Earth. They called it Mother Earth because they understood that the earth itself, soil, is where life comes from. It didn't come from any place else, except now in the oceans, of course, it came from fish and other creatures, you know. But on land, it came from the earth, the soil. And so we don't really know what's going on down there. In some ways, you could say we don't really know what's going on in our own biome, our microbiome. We get a lot more information. We have much better knowledge than 10 years ago, even. I would say the soil is I wouldn't say it's a microbiome too. It's a biome, not a microbiome. But I mean, and we don't know what's going on there because it's so complex and so changing with temperature and roots and plants and organisms and water and lack of water. So it is something that is in constant flux. Now, what we know about the agricultural societies that have been very successful over time, and there's a beautiful book called Farmers of 40 Centuries by F.H. King, but that in China and Korea and Japan, uh, basically they did something which is very obvious, which is they fed the soil. They didn't try to feed the plant. They didn't know how to. They knew how to feed the soil. And so what happened in 1920 around when Fritz Haber invented a new way to create nitrate, out of the atmosphere, which is 70% nitrogen. He was doing it in order to make more explosive bombs for the Germans. Okay, it was a war discovery. And out of that came the discovery that you could add nitrates to the soil and directly feed the plant. Okay, you're not feeding the soil, you're feeding the plant. And then out of that came, NPK, the famous triad of fertilizers that every farmer in the world uses that are made of chemicals. And so we shifted from feeding the soil to feeding the plant. And in the process, that is, plants need many more things than NPK, without which they cannot grow, but they need a lot more than that. And not to mention all the minerals. And the plants became big, green, and not necessarily strong. And they became basically susceptible to infestation, to insects. Insects said, wow, look, all this green stuff I'm going to eat, munch, especially in big row crops, big farms and so forth. And so we needed pesticides. Well, where did the pesticides come from? Right after Haber-Bosch, they came from World War I, from the poison gases that the Germans used to kill people in World War I. And that's what pesticides we use. And then it's like, okay, the war's over. What do you do? Excuse me. I'm not laughing at this. It's like so tragic, nitrogen and pesticides, And it's like, oh, okay. And that became applied to agriculture. And it worked, quote, quote, in terms of abundance and increasing yield, not so much for the traditional farmers, at all, but for basically farmed out land, which Europe was full of, by the way. What's wrong with this picture? More crops, easier to grow, more money. I mean, it just is a compounding thing. And so then, when the soil started to deteriorate because it was no longer a living medium, but a medium, you got some really pernicious weeds. Well, where did they come from? Well, all of a sudden, and it's really interesting to understand weeds. It's a beautiful book by Joseph Kokenauer, written in 1930 for the USDA. I mean, it should be in every bookstore to this day. But what he said was, and he identified all these weeds, and he said, weeds are there to heal the land, to cover the land. And then if you had Canadian thistle, it meant you had this kind of thing going on in your soil. If you had this weed, it meant that. In other words, the weeds are a tell about what has happened and what has been degraded in the land, what's missing and so forth. So then we invented herbicides, right? Oh, right. Okay, now we can kill the weeds, kill the insects, and we'll put the chemicals in the soil. Right, and the poor soil's like, it's dirt now. It really is dirt.
Now it is dirt.
Yeah, I'm sure. Finally, but so what we're in the process of doing in the world, you see it today with regenerative agriculture and many other names. It doesn't have to be regenerative and biodynamic and organic and so forth. Is basically going back to the very basic principle of farming, which is feed the soil, and that's what. In Asia, they use night soil. They use all human waste went back into the soil, but all waste went back to the soil. It was food for the soil, and so we now curiously put our waste in somewhere else, out of town, process it, right? And now they were selling that sludge. It's called back to farmers. And it turns out the sludge has perfluoroalkyl compounds, PFAs, PFOAs, and that the soil that has the sludge on it now is contaminated and you can't grow on it. So this is what we're doing, you know. And so dark earth, yeah, it's like, it is so extraordinary. And if you go to places where organic farms for sure, but where earth has never been disturbed, and you put down these delicate little sensors, you know, that are bioacoustics. Basically, they listen and record the sounds of the soil or the tree or the bird or the worm or the owl, but you put them down in the soil, and it's like an extraordinary sounds, really plural. It's not one sound, not one key. And it's like a whole nother world. The soil is making, now a scientist will say, no, it's this, it's that word, it's this, it's that, you know, they'll name the source of the sounds, but the whole of the soil is making a sound. And you place it in different sounds around the world in soil that's been really not been damaged, the sounds are all different, just like you'd expect, you know. At the same time, if you go to right in the middle of Nebraska, you know, to a soy corn, you know, industrial, you know, 10,000 acre farm with tractors and trailers and, you know, plowing this up and using lasers to guide the rows of corn. And, you know, it's industrial farming, right? Using all the chemicals. And you put that same sensor down, there's no sound at all. It's absolutely quiet. It simply tells you there's no life in the soil.
Well, this interconnection thing is sort of the theme that runs through everything. There's a fabulous chapter where you talk about how what we're actually eating and what we're made of is stardust. I mean, that's about as interconnected as you can get.
Well, actually, I call it starlight. Starlight is, of course, the light of the sun, and and that is captured by plants. And that's what I said earlier. That is to say, the plants, it's food. You know, it makes food out of light, water, right, and carbon, and that's what allows plants to grow. And we harvest it and make seeds. You know, we harvest seeds, we harvest the plants themselves. You know, we'll make sugar out of it, we'll make oils out of it, we'll make all sorts of things, cloth, you know, cotton. Yeah, I mean, eating starlight is really what we're doing. And so it gives us a profound respect for the sun, of course, but also from where our energy comes from, as opposed to coming from Nabisco or Kraft or Mars or Pepsi or General Foods. It's like, and so that just to me means we should have a kind of a reverence for our food that we don't have. And we don't have it in part because what we get is crap. I mean, 70% of our food is so processed, you know. I mean, it can be highly processed, ultra processed. Doesn't matter. It's processed here. It's not the true plant. Or if we eat an animal, the plant didn't eat the true plant, you know. I mean, it ate sorghum and stuff all mixed up with chemicals and antibiotics, you know, in CAFOs and stuff like that. Disgusting ways that we treat animals and then harvest that for food. So, you know, making starlight is really about, can we get back in touch, you know, just that awareness, you know, and I would say gratitude for what it is that we take in. Who made it? You know, who is a farmer? She did this, she did that, he did this, they do that. You know, do we connect to that? Can we? We can at farmers markets. We can in areas where, like you grew up, where we know the farmers. And that is a very important quality of our food that we're coming off from, you know, when we buy from supermarkets and we buy it from prepackaged and plastic and this and that. So I just think we deserve to reconnect ourselves to source, you know, And that source will, if we're going to be healthy, we have to be connected to source. And doesn't mean we're not going to get old and die. We are. But we can get old and die in a very different way than people are today, because basically they've torn down the body's immune system and resistance to disease and degeneration altogether. And so that's why we have a almost $5 trillion so-called healthcare industry in the United States. But you have to trace it back to where it came from food or non-food.
Yeah, you have
really.
this great chapter where you say, you talk about that. You say, people are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health, and are treated by the health industry, which pays no attention to food.
McDonald's, maybe, it was like 15, 16, 17 years ago. I don't know when it was. But anyway, they came out with a sustainability report online, and I just shredded it. And it said, you're the only company in the United States where the workers everywhere else in the world are treated better than the ones here. I mean, for starters, just like, come on, guys. And I actually knew some of the people there, the executives. We had met them, but I just shredded it and got a lot of reaction. Well, they came out with a new one 2 years later, and they got in touch and said, can we run this by you before we go out this time? And I said, sure. And they came by my office in Sausalito. And this is really important, by the way. I want to say something. This is almost everybody who's doing the things that are counter to our well-being and the well-being of the earth are really actually pretty good people. I mean, they're not assholes, bad people, with nefarious aims, and they're not. Those people exist, but they're not the people that basically run the place. And I think that he came and what I prepared for him is a little quiz. And one was ingredients of 5 different things, a pretty long list of ingredients as it was. And a lot of the ingredients were things that are made up things that we put in food. They're not actually food mixed. And we're so used to seeing them on the label that we don't think about it if we still buy that kind of food. And anyway, I asked him to identify those 5 foods. And he didn't expect that, that he was going to get a quiz. And he looked at it and he's like, no, I cannot. I said, well, let's do it again. Let's try again. And he said, okay. I said, you sell them all. I said, they're in every McDonald's in the United States. And then he was like, oh, man. Like, anyway, he couldn't identify them. I said, okay, well, let's do an easy one. Let's just do the nutrition panel, the mandated USDA nutrition panel on protein, fat, sodium, etc. Very simple, calories. And I said, there's 3 panels, 1, 2, 3. And I said, which one's the double cheeseburger? And again, he was like, this is a trick question. And I said, it's not a trick question. It's your ingredients. It's your panel. And he said, well, it's probably that one. I forget what he said. I said, no. No, it's the one with the highest calories. He said, that's probably the one with the highest calories. I said, nope. I said, well, what is the one with the highest calories? I said, your salad, 1,440 calories.
What?
Yeah.
Why? Yeah. The dressing was just nothing but sugar?
Yeah, it was like.
Yeah, the dressing was nothing but sugar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's so sweet. And so that's why it's called sugar salad, because it just, like McDonald's had made a big thing about, we're going to sell salads, unhealthy food. And then they withdrew it about 8 months later and took it off the menu. And this is their quote, we're slimming down our menu. It's like, yeah, slim it down. But I just wanted to give that as sort of an opening into just what our food isn't. We have most of our food on the ultra processed, like UPFs are called, have ingredients that weren't in any food 50 years ago. I mean, none. They didn't exist, anti-caking agents and these things that all have a function, but they actually don't have any nourishing value whatsoever. And they may have some value, they may harm too. I'm not saying they do or don't. It depends on each one. But just to give a sense of, how far away we stray from food.
And that's one of the things that I take away from your book as well. There's these wonderful moments where we see things with fresh eyes, like salad isn't always good. But gosh, your chapter about paper eyes,
Mm.
People don't like insects, but here you are pointing to all the wonder and
Yeah.
potential and the importance of insects in the whole carbon flow. I mean, that chapter, Paper Eyes, talk to us a little bit about why that made the book.
Well, paper eyes are referring to eye spots, and eye spots on butterfly wings are exactly that. They look like an eye. And the Mexican owl butterfly, it's about 6, 7-inch, 8-inch. It's a big butterfly. It comes out just before dusk, and then you can see it. And I swear, if you look at it and you Google it, you look at those eyes, and I like to draw, and I couldn't. I had all the time in the world. I could not draw an eye as good as on that butterfly. Okay, and the reason for that is it's what's flying, that something that would predate it, because lots of birds and so forth will eat butterflies. Well, oh no, I'm not going to touch that. It's an owl, and those are owl eyes. So we think of pollinators as pests. Oftentimes, we use that word interchangeably. But so, how did that butterfly get its eye spots? Well, you think about it, and then you go to science, and this is where science sort of fails, in my opinion. It's not wrong; it just fails. It says, "Well, it's genetics." Thank you for sharing. But how? How did? Okay, but when did which butterfly start to think? Did a thing to make things on its wings that would actually deter, another bird and a predator, a bat, and nobody can really explain that gap. It was like, how do you get from there to here? And it's beautiful, and it's functional, and it's just so true in the living world and in the pollinator insect world, where extraordinary capabilities, and like the Army, or the Air Force has studied dragonflies to study stationary, how to be stationary, because a dragonfly, when it's about ready to go to its prey, a little fly or something, will move itself because it knows there's a sight line from the fly, whatever it is. If it looks at it, it always wants to stay in the shade just so it can't see it. And the dragonfly is going like this. It's hovering, using its wings, transparent wings, and so forth. And that way it can get the fly, get what it wants to eat, And this is a creature that basically lives for 5, 6 weeks in the air, and the rest of the time, 3, 4 years is, nymphs in the water. And so it comes out for, like 5, 6 weeks, several weeks, to breed, basically, so the deeper you go into the insect world, the more intelligence and things that are sort of inexplicably developed or evolved over time and so forth. And what that leads me to think about is this idea of the mind of life itself, because we definitely have this attitude that because we have, a million words and this and that, we can speak, that we're so far above other creatures in terms of intelligence. Well, in the type of intelligence we have, that's true, of course, but in terms of overall intelligence, we might want to step back on that one, I mean, even this is not a butterfly, this is an elephant, but an elephant, there's Katie Payne, And Katie Payne is a scientist, but her husband's Roger Payne, by the way, who was the first one that recorded, blue whales and the sound that they make, and it became, whales that people use in music, and it became Nat Geo put the sounds in magazines, and 10 million people, it's beautiful, beautiful sounds, and we know so much from Roger Payne's work. Well, his wife was in Portland, and she was studying elephants, but she noticed that the elephants were kept in different areas, kind of elephants are matriarchal, and don't put two matriarchs in the same place. They'll fight, and so they know how to do that in zoos. But she noticed that these two elephants would stand on different sides of a very high concrete wall, with their kind of heads not on the wall, but to the wall at the same time. Like, what? Why? What are they doing? And it was a colleague of hers that said, she was trying to record it, record the sound. He said, take the sound and speed it up. No, it's take the recording, like 33 RPM, right? 38. No, it's just speed it up. They were talking, they're communicating with each other in infrasound, excuse me. Okay. And so out of Katie's discovery came scientists who went to Africa and started looking at how elephants were communicating. And they can send that infrasound, gosh, they're not sure how far, 10 miles, 15 miles. And so when elephant clans want to get back together, they start communicating, in the forest, in the savannah, and they hear each other, and they all start to come back together because of the sound. It's the family saying, hey, come on, everybody, let's get back together. We can't hear it, right? And so how did they learn that? And where did that sound come from? And it's a sound to protect them from lions, from predators, right? They said, well, that doesn't work. No, don't do that. So again, this kind of meticulously thought out, again, thinking, I don't know, evolution of intelligence, as a species, surrounds us. And we are only now becoming more deeply aware of it, really a whole new flock of scientists are out there in the world and nature with different instrumentation and a different way of seeing the world. And it's just beautiful what's happening.
Does that lead back to something you talk about? There's a pretty good chapter where you're talking about bioethicist Melanie Challenger, and you talk about how we're trying to design life on our own terms, even while we're killing life on its terms. Like another place you say, we don't know if we love life. We aren't choosing what we love very carefully. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. I don't think we know where we live. There's 3.4 trillion creatures here besides us, okay? And they're communicating every day. They're communicating. Okay, the number one way life communicates is gas.
Smells? I do not know.
Almost everybody would say sound, right?
Yeah, that's what I guess something else.
It's light.
How?
Light, literally light.
Light. Oh, really?
The greatest majority of creatures on Earth are beneath 1,000 feet in the ocean. Beneath 1,000 feet, the creatures are down. That's the majority of life on Earth. And it's too dark. You can't see anything. Once you get down that low, nobody can see anything. There's no light there. And so that's why they communicate with bioluminescence. And we know bioluminescence from fireflies, it occurs above sea level, so like that. But the fact is that's what we don't know where we live. Like, that's the majority of life is communicating with life. Of course, that doesn't have directly affect us. I get that, But the fact is that the other, I don't forget number of creatures, trillions, that are land-based and air-based, and are communicating every millisecond. They're all over, and it's just like they're talking. They're talking
When
to
do you
each
think
other.
we feel? What do you think it would take for us to feel more part of that and responsible for it and responsible for protecting it? What's
That's
it
a
going to
really good
take?
question. One, just to be educated, especially if you're 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years old, just great. Children just boom, they gather. They can
Yeah,
hear,
they
see,
can.
touch, connect. I mean,
Yeah,
that's lifelong. That just sets.
yeah.
So that's one, education. And two is really to do, there's a book about whales speak. It's a really beautiful book about how whales speak. I mean, when you learn what is happening that we know about in terms of uh, the exquisite and subtle nature of the communication that's occurring, then you want to strip away the, I guess, the belief that we all kind of inherited that, gorillas grunt and chimpanzees scream and elephants, do this and with their trunk. And so we have very, very narrow sense of what's going on. I think they're making noises, they're squawking, they're doing that and so forth. But the same with pigs, cows, and everything. And that what we're learning is that, oh, no, wait, there's a whole range of meaning and being conveyed by these animals between each other and to others. And so there's AI, there's these Raskin and others, down here, basically using AI to start to take these sounds and then doing pattern recognition, start to look for things that are repeated, and then start to look at whether repeated in context. There was a scientist at the London University, Adamansky. No, excuse me, it's the Royal Society. Yeah. And what he's been recording is mycelia in these little 2-cell, if you call that thick, strands. You see them as kind of white strands, in rich soil. Okay. The mycelia are communicating as well. And they're communicating the way the San people communicate, which is clicks. Now, I'm not imitating San people, I'm just clicking. Okay. So he's recorded all these clicking sounds and so forth. And what he's discerned is that there's words. Now, words doesn't mean vocabulary like English or Albanian. It means that they're discrete packets of clicks that repeat themselves, and so it's not random. No, it's not just a sound, And then he starts to see that these packets of sounds, which he's calling, in a sense, discretely a word or something, some symbolic meaning, occur in sequences. And these could be called sentences because, or a bar of music, I guess, I don't know, the measure of music. And he's saying that the structure of the Mycenaean language is as complex as Indo-European languages. Well, I mean, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm not saying I don't believe that. All I'm saying is we are at the cusp of people using scientific methodology, discovering what is out there, who is out there, what they're saying, what they perceive, how they respond to what they perceive, which is, now, how are we different than them? Now we are, of course, different. I mean, nobody has a million words, no animal has a million words, but we have. But in areas that are exquisitely brilliant, what we're seeing is creatures who have intelligences that we do not have. We do not have. And we, as somebody said, we may not have the intelligence enough to understand the intelligence of an animal. We may not have that intelligence. And we think they don't have the intelligence to understand us. So there's this interesting, contretemps sort of thing that, between we don't know what animals are saying and talking to each other, but I'm just saying is that I think we're coming to a place where it's awe, it's wonder. It's like, oh my gosh, who knew? And we're just tapping that, just getting into that realization. There's a beautiful book, A Sound of Life by Karen Bacher. Extraordinary book. She was, I say was, unfortunately, but a Canadian scientist. She died very suddenly, 53, brilliant writer, brilliant scientist, about the sounds of life. And also points to all the other people in the world, not all the other people, but many other people in the world who have really broken ground in this area. Like we never knew the turtles made any noise at all. And then, they do. And not only make noise, they're talking. And not only talking,
oh, there's so much. Maybe that's the big takeaway of the book, is this wondrous world that we're just not hearing enough about to even appreciate things like we should, to be able to very willingly live more sustainably and more generatively. Like, you can't love something that you don't know. You can't fall in love with the future if you think it's ugliness and catastrophe. You can't fall in love with this planet and want to protect it with every fiber of your being if you don't know anything about it. And I think that's the big message of the book, Paul, is that there's so much we don't know yet, but what we do know is so wondrous.
We're on a threshold, though, of explosion and understanding. Ben Zander was a conductor of Boston Symphony.
Yeah, one of my very first,
yes,
I say most inspiring guy that made me start the Goodness Exchange 12 years ago.
There you go. Ben, he's an amazing guy. But he said to me once, because I was asking him about conducting. What are you doing up there? You got the baton and all that stuff. But he said, I'm listening. I said, okay. And he said, leadership, and this is what I remember, is listening to all the voices. And we don't listen to all the voices. And that isn't like saving the earth and doing that and putting up solar panels across the desert in California. That's not this thing I'm going to fix things. It's about changing who you are and how you see the world. It's like, for me, writing Carbon, the Book of Life, and then reading a lot of literature, some of which is going to go into the next book I'm doing right now, but about the pollinators and insects. I cannot kill an insect now. I mean,
I can't either. I can't either, Paul.
I'll find a way to get into something jar, then take it out. I mean, I can't kill a scarab. I can't.
Me too. Me too. Like, I was just on a family vacation in Mexico, and I was really sick the whole entire time. Went there with the beginning of something, and it just got worse. And just the way things worked out, we had this one little place that I could go back and forth 40 feet to the bedroom, to a spot in the yard that we had rented. And I spent the whole time watching ants, pretty much listening to several books on tape all at the same time and watching the ants and all the things they were doing. And it was almost a gift, this illness, because it made me able to focus on the smallest of things that I hadn't given any thought to. And what if that's everything out there? Like, that's, I think, what you're suggesting with the flow of carbon in our world. It is everything, and it ties everything together. And if this interview had just been 3 minutes, Paul, do you have something like, sometimes when you just watch the news or you see the direction that we're going to with climate mitigation or whatever, do you have something you just really wish people knew? Just some really basic thing. And what do you want to share with us here as we wrap up? What do you really wish people knew?
I mean, in Project Drawdown Regeneration, it's very much do books. This is what you can do, and they stand up, they hold up. I'm not disavowing that, but I feel like if you can come to a point where because this onslaught of information about what we're losing, which, and the sorrow, the grief to go with that. Yeah. But just say, like, got it. Thank you. Got it. Now, what are you going to do? But if you stay in that, you are crippled by the understandable quality of your heart and grief and sadness and depression and worry and fear. But those are there for a reason. But at this point in time, is to acknowledge it, not to, pretend it's not there. It is there and so forth. But your grief comes from one area, that comes from love. If you didn't love children, your family, your place, other animals and so forth, if you didn't love them, there's no grief whatsoever. It's like, whatever. You are feeling grief. And that comes from love. And love only comes from one place, and that's the heart. It is the organ that always tells the truth. Your heart never lies, ever, ever. And so to embrace it, every morning I wake up, I have to read this stuff, and that, recover. But it's like, got it. Now I am going to, now you fill in the blank. I don't know what that blank is for you, but that's not for me to say. It's for me to figure it out for myself. And for me, I love to share and write and, but that's just one thing one person can do. Many people do. Look at what you're doing and so forth, And we never know when some word, some sentence, some poem, some observation, some experience changes our life, and changes the life around us.
Is it easier, or can you comment on the localness of our action? I'm starting to look at all the people I've interviewed and written about. And it seems like there are some extraordinary individuals that can set out to change the future and save the rainforest with old cell phones. I like Topher White. Okay. There are the Topher Whites of the world. Yep. But really, I'm beginning to think that it's all local. Like, if we can just figure out what our little role is in our little world, and everybody had that same feeling, that's the world changing.
Yeah, because that's how life works. Life doesn't work from the top down. It never has. It never will. Whether it's the conference of the parties or whether it's this or that and so forth, I'm not gainsaying them. Go ahead, talk. Do you want to fly in there and have, wine at dinner? But you do not change the world from the top down, and you change it from the bottom up, because it's not the bottom, it's the origin.
It's joy. That's huge.
Yeah.
It's not the bottom, it's the origin. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember Topher when he just started it, and just this clear, obvious to him, brilliant. And then you gather money and you enact it and, and act it out, and do it and refine it and make it better. And Lord knows what he's done to prevent, damage to animals, to the rainforest, to people. It's hard to, since the list goes as arm as long as his arm, some, but that's just one person. And that's why I say all change starts with one person. It has to. It can't start with two people. One always becomes two and four and eight. But that's the way life works. It starts with the cell. It always starts with the cell. And the thing about cells is they like to split and make two. And then they make four and they eight and so forth. And so it's not reductionist to look at ourselves that way. It's just the mechanism of life itself, and we are life itself. So why not act it? Don't let other minds who have other agendas, ruin your mind.
Well, that is the bottom line, isn't it? That's the nature of our world right now, if we're not careful what we give our attention to. And that's why I'm interviewing you, because I want people to give their attention to folks who have fresh ideas and who point to things we might never have known without them. And this is the gift of Paul Hawken. I can't thank you enough for sharing just stories of wonder and possibility, because, for every story that you did have time to talk to us about, there are 100 more like that. I can highly recommend the book. It comes out around my birthday, March 18th. What day does it come out?
March 18th?
Yeah, that's my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so by the time, and this podcast is scheduled to come out just a few days before that, I'm sure people will be able to get it on Amazon. Can they pre-order it now already? Is there a
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. And today it hit number 1 in Amazon on climatology. Climate, number
Okay.
1.
All right.
So somebody's pre-ordering. Yeah.
All right. Well, if you want to discover a book that makes you feel like you can handle the grief that Paul was just referring to about our climate and our world in a way that's actionable, that makes you feel like you have agency, that makes you feel like there's still an awful lot of wonder worth preserving, Paul has this way of saying things, and then you say to yourself, why didn't anyone ever say it like that? And so I can't thank you enough for just adding these fresh insights to the world, Paul.
You're so welcome. I think for your reader, though, I think hopefully when they read it, they're saying something else, which is, I know that. In other words, we do. I don't mean the detail about Mexican owl butterflies. I'm not talking about that.
Yes.
But just at the core essence, we all know.
Yes, we do. Oh, beautiful, beautiful.
Good.
Well, thank you, Paul Hawken. I hope everyone listening today will have a spring in their step after our conversation, and I can't wait to hear and talk to you about the next book after this, Paul.
Okay. Thank you so much.